And thank you for joining us tonight. We had a little bit of a worrying moment when it just wouldn't go live. We're fine now. I'm so delighted to be introducing you to Ken Gerhard, who is a cryptozoologist, and that is the study of hidden animals. You might have seen Ken on many programs. He's a lecturer, an author, and has travelled to some many interesting places to look for these hidden animals. My first ever glimpse of Ken was on a fantastic program called Missing in Alaska. He's currently on The Proof Is Out There. I've been seen on Monster Quest. The Unexplained with William Shatner is just to name just a few. So we're going to be hearing about cryptids. Hello Patricia, nice to see you on here. And I'm just really excited and delighted to be introducing Ken. And it came yesterday, his wonderful, wonderful book, The Essential Guide to Loch Ness Monster and Other Cryptids. And so do get your questions in. Ken, thank you so much for joining us here this evening and this afternoon for you.
Well, good evening, Paul. It's an honor to be here with you. Thank you for having me on your live stream, and I look forward to some engaging conversation here over the next hour or so.
Excellent, thank you, Ken. Hello to Cherry as well. Good to see you on here. Thanks for joining in with us. Well, I want to start with this, Ken, is that I know that you had, as a child, you had an interest in all sorts of animals. You had some interesting, unusual pets yourself, and you had a fishing holiday where you went and spent time looking for the Loch Ness Monster and speaking to locals, and had a little 8mm camera with you to take some video footage. Can you just say that journey that you had when you first became interested in the cryptids, and when you actually thought, oh, this is a really fascinating subject?
Yeah, well, of course, that's one of the most frequent ones I get is how did you get into this? Because it's such an unconventional sort of pursuit. What I tell people is that my father was a scientist. He was a forestry professor, so we certainly spent a lot of time in the outdoors. And I grew up in kind of a scientific household per se, in terms of what kind of tree is that? Let's go out and look at the stars and identify constellations. My first pet was actually a small alligator known as a caiman, and then I had a number of exotic pets growing up. I loved sort of running around in the woods and collecting snakes and salamanders and different things. And I also grew up really loving monster movies. So like Godzilla and, Creature from the Black Lagoon, you name it. So when I was about 8 or 9 years old and I first saw a TV show about Bigfoot, it was just like something clicked. It was, to me, Bigfoot embodied kind of the best of both worlds. It was a monster, seemingly, this big hairy man-like creature. But it also, it quite possibly was an undiscovered animal, something out there that we just hadn't found yet. And growing up, I just kind of immersed myself in, every book I could find on the subject. This was back in the 70s, of course. And Bigfoot, iconic time for Bigfoot and other cryptids on TV, because we had sort of old shows like In Search of with Leonard Nimoy, and documentaries, and there was a movie called The Legend of Boggy Creek. So there was a lot of Bigfoot and other cryptids or mystery animals in different TV shows and things. My mother was a travel agent. She was a pretty big influence. She used to tell me stories about the Yeti and the Mothman and all of these fabulous creatures. But she also got great discounts on travel, and she loved to travel. So I got to travel all over the world with her when I was growing up. But you're right. At age 15, she arranged for my father and I to vacation at Loch Ness. My father's an avid angler, and he's probably maybe mildly curious in the mystery. But as a 14, 15-year-old, I had an 8mm movie camera. I spent a lot of time there at the lake, sort of just camped out near the ruins of Urquhart Castle with my camera. I did interview a lot of local people and try to get different perspectives. And so I guess that was a pretty seminal event in my young life, because it really kind of illustrated the fun involved in exploration and kind of exploring these different mysteries. So I certainly never planned to make cryptozoology a career. It's just something I've pursued my whole life. And I've just been very blessed. I've had some great opportunities to travel and As you said, I've gotten on some TV shows and I've written books, and it's, I just have a lot of fun with it.
Must say a quick few hellos. Hello to Ray, Colette, Paul, hello to you, Ian, Jim, Lana, thanks for joining us. And I will get to Patricia's question very shortly, which Patricia asked, can I ask him what he thinks the Loch Ness Monster could be? Before we get to that though, what I also wanted to say, which I found very interesting and fascinating, is that with the Loch Ness Monster, and we will also talk about other cryptids as well, but that people tend to think of the Loch Ness Monster Nessie as more of a sort of dinosaur with a neck sticking up. But I've heard you say that people that have claimed to see it say something that looks very different, and if you can explain about that, and also put Patricia's question what the Loch Ness Monster could be in your view.
Yeah, well, certainly the prevalent image that we have of the Loch Ness Monster Nessie is something called a plesiosaur, which is a not technically a dinosaur, but closely related. It was a marine reptile with, a big body, 4 paddles, a long, powerful tail, and then, of course, it had this very long vertebral column with a long, skinny neck with a snake-like head. And one of the reasons I think that this became kind of the image that we kind of all took to heart was, back in 1934, there was something called the surgeon's photo that was taken early on in the Loch Ness saga, which has since been proved to most likely be a hoax. But it's the image that almost every one of your listeners and viewers probably has in mind, which is this shadowy form coming out of the loch with the little head and the neck sticking up there and a small hump. So that image was very, to this day, it's still kind of widely disseminated. And then there were some early reports of the Loch Ness Monster that alleged that it was on land. There was a couple, Mr. and Mrs. George Spicer. There was a guy named Arthur Grant, a young guy that both claimed in 1933 and 34 to see Nessie on the shore. And they described it as basically looking like a plesiosaur. The problem with that theory through the years is that, according to local Nessie researchers, only about 15%, and keep in mind there have been thousands of documented sightings or alleged sightings of Nessie, but only about 15% of those describe a head and neck. The vast majority of sites are describing basically very large humps, either 1 or 2 or multiple humps that come out of the water, smooth skin, dark color, and kind of move up and down like this, what we call vertical undulation on the top of the water. And these humps usually stick out, according to the descriptions, 5 feet out of the water, maybe they're 10, 20 feet long or whatever. So that's what typically people are describing, are these big humps. And, so this doesn't necessarily scream plesiosaur if you know anything about the anatomy of a plesiosaur, but some other things we have to point out in terms of, and keep in mind, Paul, that I tend to approach all of these mysteries from a strict zoological perspective. Cryptozoology is really about zoology in terms of the foundation. So in order for something to actually exist in Loch Ness, something large and unknown, you would certainly have to have certain biological questions addressed. And one of those would be, what does it eat? Why is it seen more often? If it were a plesiosaur, for example, we know those were air breathers. They would certainly be coming to the surface a lot to breathe. They're carnivores, so they would be eating a lot of fish, and we might see an impact in the local fish population. And perhaps most importantly, from what we know of the anatomy of the plesiosaur, it was not able to actually lift its head and neck up in this swan-like fashion above the water. The way its vertebrae actually locked, it's when it swam in the water, it was kind of flat in the water with its head down like this. So it wasn't really designed to do that type of. So there's a number of questions, I think, or issues with the plesiosaur theory. So certainly there have been other theories put forward. One of the more conservative ones is that it could be a gigantic eel. We know there are a lot of eels already, conger eels that live in Loch Ness, although the largest ones we know of are only about 5 feet long. So we would have to theoretically be talking about an eel that was maybe 3 or 4 times that big, which has never been documented. But to answer Patricia's question, one of the hypotheses that I put forward in my book, which is not my invention, it's something that was suggested by prior cryptozoologists, and I've just kind of revisited it, was the possibility that Nessie could be a mammal, and specifically a prehistoric type of ancient whale known as a basilosaur or archaeocete. These were primitive snake-like whales that lived from the Oligocene up to maybe the Miocene, so like 40 to 20 million years ago in that period. And they had a very long snake-like body, very different from modern whales. And the things that we could argue in favor of the Archaeocete basilosaur theory is that the movements that are described of it swimming up and down like this is strictly a mammalian characteristic. That is, aquatic mammals like seals, otters, whales, pinnipeds all swim up and down. That's how they flex in the water. The things that swim side to side are reptiles and fish. So we can't imagine that a plesiosaur, for example, would be able to make its back do that kind of flexion. The other thing is that whales, they are air breathers also like plesiosaurs, but they can actually hold their breath for a very long time. Some species of whales can hold their breath up to 4 hours. They go to great depths, so they may not be seen as often. The smooth whale-like skin that's often described in eyewitness accounts fits the bill. Whales are known to travel from salt water into fresh water on occasion. That happens in the Thames River, here in the States, the St. Lawrence and other bodies of water. So we could maybe make an argument that these creatures like Nessie actually live in the ocean and travel into lochs like Ness from time to time. And, so those are the main things. So I think, and also whales are better adapted to cold water, which we know, of course, Loch Ness is very cold. It never freezes, but it's about 47 degrees Fahrenheit on average. A reptile like a plesiosaur might have a difficulty adapting to that environment, but whales, of course, do quite well in cold water. So I just think there's more arguments to be made in terms of something like a primitive prehistoric whale as opposed to a primitive reptile like a plesiosaur. But who knows? It's all speculation. We really don't know.
And that's what you say, is that it's speculation what you do. So I just want to say hello to Jane, who says she's Scottish. Andrew, hello to you. Stephanie, hello. Anne, hello to you. Ray's here. And Jeff Drake has enjoyed your presentations. So yeah, and do get that mentioned about any that are coming up soon. I will be moving on to another cryptid at some point because we've got so many different cryptids to get through. But I was hearing and find it quite interesting that there is a well-known, and his name escapes me, skeptic, but he's also a big fan of the Loch Ness Monster. He has a beard, quite a well-known famous person in Scotland. You said about he was doing like sonar, and that although he says there's a link in there, he actually picked up some large objects in sonar. So, and you also said about how sonar can miss as well. So you can explain a little bit about that, and then probably then also move to a different cryptid then.
Yeah, absolutely. The gentleman you're referring to is named Adrian Shine.
That's it. Forgot it for a second.
Yeah, he's been running the Loch Ness Exhibition Center in Drumnadrochit for years, but he actually started researching Scottish lake monsters in 1972, I believe, when he went up to Lake Morar, and they have a monster named Morag. It's not too terribly far away from Nessie, but it's kind of the water visibility is much better there. So he did a project there for a couple years, and then he moved to Loch Ness for a number of years, and he became more skeptical as he searched because he just didn't feel like there was enough evidence to really support this fabulous possibility. But in October of 1987, he organized this thing called Operation Deep Scan. And what that was basically a flotilla of 25 vessels, each armed with a low-rance sonar unit. And the concept was for all of these boats to move in unison across Loch Ness and basically imagine a giant web of sonar. And I'm assuming that most of your listeners know what sonar is. It's a technology that's still widely, and probably more widely used now than it ever was. But basically, the concept is you beam sound waves through the water They bounce off an object. It's called echolocation, and then it comes back, and basically that data is analyzed, and you can get kind of a general idea of what's in the water, what's down below in terms of objects that are, animate or stationary. The technology has improved dramatically through the years. But anyways, in 87, they were using these sonar units. Adrian's idea at that point, in his own words, was to basically sweep the loch clean of the monster. So he was very interested in doing research in Loch Ness in terms of a lot of interesting biology. It's an interesting lake. There's a lot to study there in terms of the biology, microscopic life forms and wave effects and some of those things. But the very first day, and this was a huge media event, keep in mind, there were like hundreds of media people from around the world had descended on Loch Ness for this event. On the very first day, they did make contact with two animate objects that were about, I think, like 20 or 30 feet long. And they went back and turned around and tried to relocate them. They had moved. And so that was a pretty big deal on the first day of Operation Deep Scan. The second day, they did not pick up anything on sonar. But to this day, Adrian, who is a self-avowed skeptic of the Loch Ness Monster, still admits that, yes, there were two sonar contacts that we had. We don't know what they were. He won't say, that they're the Loch Ness Monster, but they are unidentified. But that's just one aspect of a long-standing body of evidence dating back to December of 1952, when a trawler called the Rival 3 picked up a large unidentified animate object under the surface. Throughout the 60s and 70s, there were different scientific teams from the University of Birmingham there in England, a guy named Dr. Dennis Tucker. There was a group from here from the States, the Academy for Applied Science in the early 70s, Operation Deep Scan. I mean, even in recent years, there have been, as recently as I think September of 2020, there was a local boat captain there, Roland O'Brien, who captured a pretty impressive contact of something about 500 feet down. That's was very large, 30 feet long or whatever. So I think the sonar evidence for Nessie is often overlooked, and I think many of the photographs we know or suspect have been hoaxed. So the photographic evidence for Nessie doesn't necessarily stand up as a whole, but the sonar evidence, I think, in conjunction with the eyewitness sightings, thousands of those, which are very consistent, I think you can really build the best case that something mysterious does exist in Loch Ness.
Now, I know, I'll just get this up from Patricia. Before I ask Patricia's question, I know that you say that Bigfoot, which we'll probably get onto next, you're about 90% sure that there is something there, and 90, not 100, because you haven't seen it. Where do you put the Loch Ness Monster on that scale?
I would say in the same ballpark. I think based on the evidence, and I always try to look at these things as in the big picture. It's important to kind of, I think, widen your view and look at how the evidence corroborates. The eyewitness accounts, the sonar, the photos that are compelling. There are a few videos and photos that are interesting. I would say that I would give Nessie and similar lake monsters around the world, because surely if Nessie exists, it's the same species that we see in other northern latitude lochs here in the States, Canada, Russia, Scandinavia, Iceland, wherever. Maybe 80% chance that it exists. And actually, zoologically speaking, you could probably make a better argument for water cryptids, aquatic cryptids, than something like Bigfoot, because, 2/3 of the planet, over 2/3, is covered by deep water that's thousands of feet deep. So, I mean, even the most conservative scientists will tell you, yeah, surely there could be things in the oceans and deep in lakes and waterways that we haven't seen, which it might be more challenging to make that something that's on land moving around as much as the planet is being developed these days. So.
Absolutely. I must say hello to Cowabunga, who has joined. Michelle, hello to you. Kerry, thank you for watching. Cheryl, that's lovely to see you too. Patricia put here, Loch Ness has very unusual waves due to the size of the loch. Could they be mistaken for humps of an animal?
Truly. I think that with regard to all of our cryptids, we are essentially dealing with cases of what we call composite identity, meaning there are lots of different things sort of being lumped together. So I like to think that there might be a mystery, a remarkable mystery animal at the root of these, whether you're talking about the Loch Ness or Bigfoot or whatever. But you do have cases of misidentification. People do see things like waves and wave effects, large fish, debris in the water, and could most certainly mistake that for Nessie, depending on the situation. So that does happen, and there's hoaxing is a factor too. Unfortunately, there are people that just want to make up stories and get in the newspaper or put it on their website. So certainly I think you could make an argument that a percentage of Nessie sightings are misidentifications. To her point, I don't think you can necessarily do that with all of the sightings when you really read the accounts and hear what's described. It clearly something alive is what many people have described.
So Cowabunga says, what's the estimate lifespan of some of these cryptids, and how do they reproduce or find mates since they seem so rare? Interesting question. I've not actually thought about the lifespan before. Is that something you've thought about?
That is a good question. Well, if we're going to do a wrap on our aquatic cryptids like Nessie, and of course this is all pure speculation, none of us really know, but I'll try to equate it to other animals, known animals. So in terms of like the Loch Ness Monster, if it was some type of undiscovered or prehistoric whale, like I'm suggesting, maybe 50, 60 years, maybe longer depending on what it has. So certainly there would have to be a breeding population somewhere to continue that lineage. In terms of Bigfoot, there's an interesting case from Ontario, Canada. There's a specific Sasquatch, that's what they call them in Canada, mostly not Bigfoot so much, known as Yellowtop, that's been reported from this little town called Cobalt in northern Ontario. And what's interesting about Yellowtop is he has a very distinct color pattern. He's kind of a dark body covered with fur, but a blonde hair on the head. And sightings of Yellowtop date back to they started in 1924, and they ended about 1970 was the last documented. So and you would assume that there's not more than one animal or individual that would have that highly unusual marking or color combination. So using that as a context, then we would say that, well, Yellowtop would theoretically have lived at least 50 years, which kind of puts it in the same ballpark as other great apes like humans. Humans pre-medical technology, probably lifespan was probably about 50 years. Gorillas, big silverback males, maybe 50 years. So I think in terms of a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, we could speculate that the lifespan would be something in that neighborhood, 50 years, maybe a little bit longer. And certainly, again, we'd have to have a breeding population that continue since sightings have continued for centuries. So
Brilliant. Before I move on to the next one, also get you to say where people can follow you and see your talks and buy your books. Michelle said, I'm going there at the end of May, Nessie hunting with the kids. So yeah,
nice.
It's going to be really nice. Before we probably move on to Bigfoot, and then hopefully I can talk about big cat sightings in the UK and around the world as well. If you can say how people can get hold of seeing you, and I know that if anybody has an experience, you like them to be quite short, and you're not going to be able to go out and investigate everything that people send through. But if people are interested, want to follow you, websites, books, please let people know about that.
Well, I appreciate that, Paul. My main website is kengerhard.com. I'm also on social media: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I have a YouTube channel, though admittedly I haven't been real good about putting up content lately, but it's on the list. And if people are interested in my books, they can go to Amazon, and it's worldwide, so amazon.uk, the UK version, or if people are in Australia, wherever, they can find copies of my books on there.
Also, as well, regarding your YouTube channel, I really like the short video about the different cryptids. And also there's about a 30 minute documentary where you go out, and that was really enjoyable. I really enjoyed that. And what was interesting is one of your friends that you went with said that some of the Sasquatches are more aggressive than others, and they think it might potentially be some sort of inbreeding because there's 3 toes found. What's your view on that? And if you could explain a little bit more for the people that haven't watched that documentary, which I highly recommend people do on Ken's channel.
Yes, absolutely. Well, first, let me reach for something here, if you'll excuse me. I'll just go out of frame for just a moment here. So this is an archetypical Bigfoot or Sasquatch footprint here. This is called the Grays Harbor cast from 1982. One of the really compelling lines of evidence in terms of Bigfoot or Sasquatch is we have hundreds, if not thousands, of giant human-like footprints that have been found in North America, documented, measured, photographed, and in this case, plaster was put in there and they made a cast of it, right? This is a duplicate, it's not the original. But the morphology or the design of these Sasquatch feet is very consistent. It looks superficially like a human print, but it's not. The toes are actually proportionally smaller. The foot is much wider, so a 2-to-1 ratio, and longer heel. And, this is exactly what you would have to have, according to a couple of physical anthropologists like Dr. Jeff Meldrum, Dr. Geographic that have studied these footprints extensively, said this is exactly what an 800-pound bipedal, 2-legged ape, great ape, running around the forests of North America would have to have. So that's pretty consistent. Now, as you suggested, there have been occasionally footprints that have been found that have been attributed to Bigfoot with either 3 toes or 4 toes. Now, some of those might be hoaxes. We have to accept that as a possibility. There is a hypothesis, again, by the guys that study the footprint evidence, which I'm not that's not one of my main wheelhouses, but that the foot is very flexible in general compared to ours. And that occasionally, maybe when they set their foot down, not all of the toes are being impressed in the ground. But the interesting theory that was put forth by my colleague, Chester Moore, who I worked with for years in researching in Texas and Louisiana, was that perhaps there could be inbreeding, because if you consider that there's a group of Sasquatches in some area of the southeastern United States, those wilderness areas tend to be very isolated or cut off. They're not contiguous like you find in the western U.S., where you have great mountain ranges like the Cascades and the Rockies that go on for hundreds of thousands of square miles. So if there was a Bigfoot population that was isolated, that was smaller, they might inbreed, and then you would have genetic issues, genetic bottlenecks, and that's when you get mutations and things like that. So it's an interesting theory actually to consider, that you might have this situation where you have a Bigfoot with 3 toes or 4 toes due to these genetic conditions.
I'll pull up here. Where's it? Hello to you, William Morris. Hi, little brother Ken. Headed to Buff Creek Sunday for my birthday. Oh, I hope you.
Oh, right on. Very cool. That's my good friend Bill. Yep. Have fun, Bill.
And we had. What Pat's one gone? Oh, there we go. Please could you ask Ken which cryptid he would most like to see?
Wow, that's a great question. I think I've been asked that before. It's hard to choose, certainly. I think any of them would be pretty life-changing, pretty spectacular. But what I tell people is that, one of my areas of specialization in the field of cryptozoology has always been these giant, monstrous winged cryptids. Here in North America, they're referred to as thunderbirds, based on different Native American legends, that the sound of theirs like thunder and so forth. And I've interviewed many dozens of eyewitnesses who swear that they've seen these monstrous birds with wingspans from 14 to 20 feet across. Typically solid dark colored feathers, black, charcoal, gray, or brown. They generally describe the beak as being hooked, like a raptor, like an eagle or something like that, or vulture or something like that. The modern sightings kind of align perfectly with the Native American legends, which there are many different tribes and cultures that have stories of these thunderbirds. They go by a number of different native names, Wakanyan, Tlanoa, Pomola, Benesse, Chegwe, and so forth. So I think seeing one of those, can you imagine something flying overhead that has this, 14, 20-foot wingspan. That would be a pretty spectacular sight to see something like that, I think.
And there's also, I think, quite a well-known, which I haven't seen, I'm going to try and look it up, famous 1970s bit of film footage of a potential Thunderbird.
Yes.
What's that particular footage called for anybody that goes, I want to go and Google this and try and
Yes.
search it up?
That's the Lake Shelbyville footage. It was shot at a place called Lake Shelbyville in July, I believe it was July 27th, 1977. And it was shot by a guy named Texas John Huffer, who sadly I think he passed away about a year ago. But this was just after something called the Lawndale incident, where a young boy named Marlon Lowe was picked up by a giant bird, one of two giant birds, and carried about 30 feet off the ground. Not 30 feet off the ground, but 30 feet just off the ground. And this was observed by his parents and up to 7 eyewitnesses. And he finally did manage to break free from this giant bird. And about a week later is when this footage was shot at Lake Shelbyville, just south of Lawndale, Illinois. So it's inconclusive, like all footage of alleged cryptids. It is inconclusive, but it does, in my opinion, seem to show birds that are bigger than, a vulture or an eagle, or birds that you would expect to see in Illinois, and really along the size of something like an American condor, which has a wingspan of like 9 or 10 feet. And you can kind of make that judgment based on, it's flying off from the treetops. I think it's fairly easy to kind of estimate what types of trees and how big they are. So again, it's not conclusive, but it is interesting. It's the best footage that anyone has captured of one of these cryptids.
Cool. And we have a question from Ray. Paul, what's Ken's opinion on the Buffalo Creek film footage?
That would actually be Bluff Creek.
Oh, sorry, Bluff Creek. Yeah, I am dyslexic. Okay. Yeah, Bluff Creek. Oops.
Buffalo Creek sounds cool too.
Yeah.
But yeah. The Bluff Creek footage was actually shot exactly 1 week after I was born, on October 20th, 1967. Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin. It's known as the Patterson-Gimlin footage. I'm convinced it's real. I've never wavered from that position. When I first saw it, when I was like 8 or 9 years old, and I know a lot of people say, well, what do you know when you're 8 or 9 years old? Well, I knew monster movies. I grew up watching Planet of the Apes and 2001 and all those movies. So you know what a costume looks like. I mean, you got even if it's a good costume, you have a pretty good subjective opinion of that. The first time I saw that thing walking, and we call her Patty because she actually displays large pendulous hair-covered breasts, so we know it's a female. First time I saw her walking across that Bluff Creek film site, I thought, that is not a costume. You can see the muscles moving. You can see the mass is natural and seems to be attached. It's not a big floppy, puffy sort of thing. And since in the ensuing years, of course, there have been stabilizations with all the technology now. We can, granted, this was filmed on a 16 millimeter camera. The guy Roger Patterson was running at this thing. It was shaky. It was kind of, the lens he had made it look far away. So there's a lot of things that make it difficult to analyze. But using modern technology, it's been stabilized. It's been enhanced. You can see a lot of detail now in that footage. The way the breasts move when she turns, the way the toes curl up when it steps. To me, it looks completely natural. I've known Roger Patterson sadly died in 1972, just a few years after he shot that footage. But Bob Gimlin has been alive for years. He didn't really want to talk about it for years because he got a lot of ridicule and things. But 2003, he started coming out and talking about the sighting more. I've known him since about that time. I've heard him tell the story many times. It's very straightforward. There's no bluster or enhancement. He doesn't change anything. There was they rode up on horseback. They were there looking for Bigfoot footprints technically, but they had a camera. They rode their horses around this big down tree, and there this thing was drinking from Bluff Creek, from the creek. Stood up, and she walked away. And so yeah, I'm convinced it's real. Unfortunately, after 60 years almost, it's still not going to be conclusive. Unfortunately, that's never going to prove to science conclusively that these things exist. But to those of us that advocate the existence of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, that is one of the most important pieces of evidence.
well, Paul says here the Bluff Creek footage is cool. I've always kind of typed in when I've Googled it, the Patterson film, but yeah, Bluff Creek footage is cool and convinced me. And personally, for myself, I find it very compelling. You see the muscles in it, and if you see what they had in Planet of the Apes around the same, well, a little later I think it was, it just doesn't have the same kind of quality at all to it. I know because somebody might be watching this either now or sometime in the future, there was a guy that did claim to be in a suit, and he did pass the lie detector. But if anybody knows me and knows about lie detectors, I think that it's basically a flip of the coin with a
Yeah.
lie detector. So I'm very skeptical about lie detectors personally, myself. But somebody actually, a skeptical poem about Bigfoot, I saw did a mock-up of it, and still now, even though this was I think done in the 90s, it looked like a guy in a suit,
Mhm.
unlike the original footage.
Yeah, there have been
Uh,
some attempted recreations. I actually have a good friend and colleague, Ben Radford, who's a skeptic, who's constantly bringing up that, well, there's never been a true recreation where you really went all out on recreating it to see if it could be faked or not. But there have been some kind of loose recreations on TV shows and things, and you're right. They don't look, to me, they don't look nearly as convincing.
yeah, years later as well. Now, I know you said earlier you're from the actual cryptozoology and the zoology part, but I will get Jeff's question up here. Does Ken know Robert W. Morgan? I met him many years ago and spent 4 days with 6 others in Washington State. He seemed able to communicate with Bigfoot telepathically. What's your take?
Unfortunately, I've never had the honor of meeting Bob Morgan. He is in a retirement home in Ohio. He's still alive. I do have a friend named Amy Bew who spends quite a bit of time with him. But yeah, he's one of the iconic researchers. He began researching Bigfoot in the 1970s. He claimed he had a sighting in the late 50s up in Washington State, and subsequently became very active throughout the 70s and 80s. I'm not necessarily an advocate of these stories of telepathy and mind speak, orbs of light and, footprints vanishing in the middle of a trackway. And, I know those stories do exist. I acknowledge there are accounts like that. Um, but I've been investigating Bigfoot for 45 years all over North America. I've done field research all over the continent. I've worked with pretty much every leading Bigfoot investigator, and none of us have really come up with any of that. Those stories, kind of what we were talking about with the head and neck sightings for Nessie, it's a very small percentage of the data. And if you're going to look at this thing scientifically, you have to base your conclusions on the preponderance of the data, not on small percentages, which I think, when we're talking about mind speak and some of these other things, those accounts are actually pretty minuscule in terms of the large body of evidence, in my experience.
William says here, William Morris, I feel the Freeman footage should have equal footing as the Patterson. I'm going to have to say I probably have seen it. If you can explain that for those that haven't seen it or might have seen it like myself and can't remember, that would be good.
Yeah, the Freeman footage, many investigators think is probably the second best footage, still inconclusive. This was shot by a researcher named Paul Freeman, and this was in southeastern Washington State, in a place called the Mill Creek watershed. The exact location I know, but it's escaping me at the moment. But Deduck Spring in the Mill Creek watershed. And Freeman claimed to have seen a Bigfoot in 1982. He became a researcher in this area. He seemed to be a Bigfoot whisperer to many because he came up with so many footprints and sightings and things. But in 1992, he was at a particular location where he had found many footprints before, and he had a video camcorder, and he heard something. He was filming the footprints, and he hears some brush popping, and he aims the camera up, and you see this very large ape-like figure stepping between some trees. Turns its head and looks at him, and he gets kind of nervous on the camera and stuff. So that footage is, again, it looks good in terms of the mass. The thing looks pretty huge. It's hard for me to imagine that a costume would have that much breadth across the shoulders and just the trunk. Everything just seems very filled in. Doesn't look exactly like the Patterson-Gimlin footage, but close enough, I think. But Freeman was also accused of maybe hoaxing some footprints, which he admittedly did, but he did it to see how it was done. That's the part of the story. A lot of times things are misrepresented. A lot of skeptics go to talk about Paul Freeman and say, well, he admitted he faked some footprints. Yeah, he did, because that was part of his process in terms of research, was how hard is it to fake a footprint? Can I do it? So yes, he did fake some, but he never tried to pass that off. So yeah, I think the Freeman footage is probably number two. Controversial. Certainly not on the level of the Patterson-Gimlin film in terms of stature and some of the fine details and things that we can draw out of that footage. So.
Paul Locke says, I watched a clip recently of several men who camped out in the wild and claimed to have recorded Bigfoot vocalizations in a conversation almost. What's Ken's thoughts on this? And Paul, was that on The Proof Is Out There by any chance? Which I did see. So yeah, what's your opinion on those vocalizations?
Well, people always ask me if I've seen Bigfoot or any other cryptid, and I haven't. I've never had a personal sight, but I'm convinced I've heard vocalizations on a few occasions. And so I do think that is the best or the easiest evidence to experience if you're a researcher, because certainly sounds can travel in the forest, and particularly if something is big and has a projecting voice. August 18th, 2003, I was with Chester Moore, who we referenced earlier, in a place in North Texas called Cottonwood Lake. There had been Bigfoot sightings there recently. As soon as the sun went down, we were hiking around the lake and we heard something grunting at us. And I recorded this. It sounded like an ape. It was big and huge. It sounded like, oh, 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 oh. But, literally like, shook our bodies. And we all looked at each other and we're like, what the F? Because we all grew up in Texas. We knew, deer. There really aren't bears in that area, but still I know what a bear sounds like, a mountain lion, coyotes, pig, whatever. I've heard all kinds of animal voices. This was a primate sound. We weren't able to see it because it was in heavy brush. We were pretty nervous, but we tried to flush it out. We were unable to do that. We camped in that area. We heard some other things through the night, but the next morning we did find some deep human-like footprints where we'd heard this thing. And we found some turtles that had been torn in half from top to bottom, big turtles, just ripped in half. So all of that to me was pretty convincing that had to have been a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch when you factor the vocalizations, the footprints, the other evidence. I've also heard some other vocalizations, moans, whooping sounds that are very primate-like. The wood knocks people describe, I've heard those a couple of times. So that, but that's through years of research, years of field research all over the continent. I've experienced probably a handful of times things that I've heard that I thought that could very well be a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, even though I can't see what's making that sound. I can't say conclusively, but certainly that is a type of evidence that we analyze in the field, is listening to recordings that people have made of different usual sounds and vocalizations, as we call them.
Patricia puts here, and she has asked me before, could Bigfoot be the missing link? So the missing link, I think what Patricia's talking about, between Neanderthal men and, as we are today. So what's any thoughts on that?
I'm sorry, what was that question again?
Like a missing link between like Neanderthal men.
Well, the concept of missing link is sort of an antiquated in terms of anthropology and physical anthropology. The concept used to be, or the belief used to be, that there was this linear progression from apes to humans, and there's the famous graphic of like the ape and then the Australopithecus and then Homo erectus. But we now know, based on rather remarkable finds in the field of paleoanthropology, that the human evolutionary tree was very bushy. Literally, there were all kinds of side branches and dead ends and different things. But the important thing to keep in mind is that things that looked like Bigfoot did exist up until about 1 million years ago. In Africa, there were things called there was a species called Paranthropus boisei, which was a robust Australopithecine. It was basically an upright walking ape. In terms of its cranial capacity, it was about as smart as a chimp or a gorilla, but it had a completely upright walking stature, but very broad shoulders, big jaws, big cone-shaped head, receding. So, presumably hair covered. It may have had very primitive stone tools that it was chipping away, but but it looked like a Bigfoot. It was only about 5 feet tall from what we know from the fossil record, but presumably something like that, if it had survived into modern times, perhaps grown in stature, then you're talking about something that looks just like what people are describing with regard to Bigfoot or Sasquatch. So I think that's very compelling. So I think maybe that's what your viewer was insinuating, is that Bigfoot does seem to fit perfectly into the human evolutionary tree. Not necessarily one of our direct descendants, but perhaps a distant cousin from a million years ago. And that is another line of evidence that I use to sort of push back or challenge on these theories about Bigfoot being an interdimensional creature from another reality, density, whatever people say. If so, why does it look exactly like something that evolved on our planet a million years ago? That doesn't really make sense if it's from this other, if it's extraterrestrial or from another dimension. It would look radically different, I think.
Yeah. Jeff says, I don't know if this is, anyway, it says, Jeff says satellite images abilities have increased greatly over the years. Does Ken believe various governments have gathered evidence of Bigfoot in this manner?
Yeah, this is a question I get a lot too. Admittedly, Paul, I'm not a huge advocate of conspiracy theories, and perhaps it's my cynical worldview, but I've had a pretty vast life experience, traveled all over the world, and interact with thousands of people. And what I find is that people aren't generally very good at keeping secrets, and conspiracies generally involve a lot of people keeping a secret for a very long period of time. And I just don't know if something like Bigfoot could be kind of swept under the rug or hushed up.
True.
I do acknowledge that I think there are reasons that if, say, the government of the United States thought that Bigfoot might exist, that it's a can of worms that they just wouldn't want to open up. It's a red herring. It's something that would presumably create a lot of headaches for a lot of people, economic issues, social issues, legislation issues. And so it's something that's probably better for, if there are people in government that think that Bigfoot might exist, they probably just don't even want to, address it or deal with it. It would just, be a huge headache all the way around. But I don't think that there is a Bigfoot body or bodies being kept in some secret underground bunker somewhere. I just don't think that's feasible.
Cowabunga says, and this such brings on to a question I was going to ask later. Most of the Bigfoot sightings I hear about are adults. What are the sightings of Bigfoot kids? And that nicely brings me on to what I also want to ask about Littlefoot, which I've heard about as well, which isn't child Bigfoots, big feet. So if you can sort of talk about those two.
Yeah, certainly. Littlefoot is a chapter in my book, The Essential Guide to Bigfoot. As I've traveled around the continent of North America and even down into Central America, interviewing different indigenous people about Bigfoot, and they always have different localized traditions and names, they've always brought up these quote unquote little people, which are not necessarily the fairies and gnomes and things that we think about from folklore in Europe and other places, but they're generally described as being completely covered in hair, like a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, very powerfully built, but just very short in stature, like 3 to 5 feet tall. Now, certainly some of these accounts of these Littlefoot creatures might be juvenile Bigfoots or Sasquatches. That's one possibility. But you can't explain all of those away, because in the native traditions where they talk about these little people, they always make that distinction that this is a race, a group of little people, Bigfoot, Sasquatches. And for example, in Central America, they're known as the Duende. In North America, they're known as the Awakule, Narumbi, Hechesatehi. In Alaska, they're known as the Anukins, Urchin Rock. So these are all, like, I've spoken to a lot of different native tribes, Lakota, Inuit, Maya, and they all have different traditions, but they always describe the same thing, which is these little 3 to 5 foot tall, hairy creatures, man-like creatures, powerfully built, very mischievous. They're said to abduct children and steal food and different things like that. So It's kind of a forgotten or an overlooked, pardon the pun there, but it's an overlooked aspect of the Bigfoot phenomena that there could be perhaps a second species, a pygmy version, if you will, of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, perhaps a different species or a genetic variation or subspecies or something along that. That's just, again, very powerful, but just very short in terms of what people describe with Bigfoot, 6, 7 feet, 8 feet tall, or whatever.
Sam is just joining. Apologise for being late. That's okay, Sam. I hope you enjoy seeing this on catch up. Jim said Ken's book Essential Guide to Bigfoot should be in every research library. I've got a question from William coming up because we're about the last 10 minutes now of our time. Thank you so much, Ken. Do you want to do another mention of how people can see you, follow you, and also as well you've got a GoFundMe page as well. So
Oh gosh,
tell us
well
about
that
that
was
as well.
that was from an older expedition. I don't.
Oh,
Have
okay.
Thank you, though. I appreciate that. No, I have a website, kengerhard.com. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I have a YouTube channel, Amazon, and I can currently be seen on some TV shows. Most frequently on a series called The Proof Is Out There, which is on the History Channel, and certainly it's available for streaming. It might be on some other streaming sites as well. I also make an occasional appearance on a show called The UnXplained with William Shatner and Ancient Aliens. I've been on an episode of that recently. So I do occasionally pop up on different TV shows, but primarily I'm doing a lot of lectures and presentations around the U.S. this year. There are a number of different Bigfoot conferences, paranormal conferences where I'll be appearing and doing presentations. And I generally have a table set up where I sell my books, and I'm very approachable. If people want to come up to me and share their experiences or ask me a question about one of my books, I'm always open to that. So
Amazing, thank you. So coming up the last couple of questions here now. William says, any future projects you can talk about?
I'm afraid none that I can really talk about.
Fair enough.
I always have current and future projects, Bill. Thank you for asking. But I'm currently researching a project for a friend, but I'm just not at liberty to discuss it right now. I should say corroborating with a colleague and a friend. And I am currently filming the new season of The Proof Is Out There. There are a couple of expeditions I'm trying to put together too, but logistically they're not happening as quickly as I like. But hopefully I'll be out there in the field again very soon as well.
Amazing. Ray says, American soldiers during the Vietnam War reported seeing Bigfoot type creatures whilst on the tour of duty during the war. I didn't know about that actually.
Yes, they were frequently referred to as rock apes by the GIs that were over in Vietnam because they looked like apes, but they would throw rocks at the soldiers. The local name is Goi Rung, which means the forest people, and that's in Vietnamese culture. If people want to dig around, I actually did an episode on the rock apes of Vietnam and also segued that into something called the Minnesota Iceman, which we might have to save for a future interview because that's a pretty in-depth story. But there's a series I did in 2019 called In Search of Monsters, and we did an episode called Rock Apes of Vietnam, I think. If you want to dig around, you might be able to find that. That episode is pretty good, actually.
Amazing. So, we're kind of approaching the end now, but I was just curious to know, because you've spoken to lots of different people, and it's probably one of those questions that there's so many to answer, but has there been sort of like anybody with any of your research speaking to anybody that the story was sort of so compelling by even just the look in their eyes? Because I'm also into the paranormal, so, and you get this look in some people's eyes that they're just not faking it, they've really experienced something quite unusual. Is there anything that springs to mind in the last 5 minutes that we have here?
Oh gosh, yeah, the most dramatic that I can think of. So you referenced a series I used to be on called Monster Quest. In 2009, they sent me to Mexico to investigate accounts of a Mothman type creature. I'm sure your listeners have heard of the Mothman. I don't know if it's a true cryptid, but it's a winged humanoid creature that's been reported in West Virginia. And I've also interviewed eyewitnesses from elsewhere, but the most compelling eyewitness that I've interviewed was a police officer in Mexico named Leonardo Samaniego, who in June of 2004 in the middle of the night was on patrol and claims that this giant, well, I'd say giant, but this winged witch is what he called her, a bruja, a witch with giant black lidless eyes and brown skin, flew through the air and attacked his police car and was like clawing at him through the windshield. And he basically, it was too much, he couldn't handle it, and he blacked out. And he was discovered by EMT, ambulance drivers, and fellow police officers a short while later. But anyways, I got to interview him for this particular episode. And this is a pretty tough guy. I mean, he's still on the police force. He works in a really tough neighborhood in southern Monterrey, Mexico, called Guadalupe. And I mean, he was like, and granted, he doesn't speak English, so we had a translator. But just the emotions that he was expressing. And I mean, he broke down, he was weeping, you know, saying that he still had nightmares about this creature, the eyes, he could still see these big eyes. And this guy definitely experienced something. I mean, it really shook the foundation of his reality. And that was probably, of all, I've interviewed a lot of very credible eyewitnesses through the years, people that were very convincing. But this guy, you could see the emotional trauma, the PTSD that he had basically experienced as a result of this encounter. So that was pretty chilling.
Wow, that is. I'll just read these comments quickly. So, Julie, interesting topic. Anne says, great show, thank you. Hello, Cheryl. Good interview by William. Patricia says, please can you get Ken back in another time, so interesting. Some comments from Jeff there. And Cowbunga says, have loved this discussion, fascinating stuff, thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Ken, for your time. I think a few more thank yous coming through. It's been great having you on here, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this this evening here and the afternoon for you.
Oh gosh, well, thank you for having me, Paul. It's been a great interview, good questions from both you and as well as your listeners, and I really enjoyed it. Hopefully we can do this again sometime very soon.
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you so much. And Artist Lana as well says wonderful interview, so I'll probably get the messages popping through afterwards. Thank you, everyone. Whatever you're doing tomorrow or tonight, have an outstanding day. And again, once again, Ken, thank you.